Macy's has all of your Grill Master essentials for Father's Day. Stop by to get our hand-trimmed chicken breast and certified Angus beef patties that are ready to grill, so Dad can have his favorite dinner. Make sure to browse our bakery to find the perfect no-work Father's Day treat with our decadent peanut butter bars or famous donuts. Right now, you can get boneless beef ribeye steaks for $12.99 per pound at Macy's. Shop these Father's Day essentials in-store or online at Macys.com through June 18th. Macy's, happy shopping!
Enjoy the taste of summer no matter what the weather when you head to Maverick for some Mountain Dew Baja Blast. You'll love the legendary, refreshing tropical lime flavor. And to make the sweetness last longer, Maverick now has it in 1-liter bottles. For a limited time, get 2 for $5. Single purchase regular price. Plus, Adventure Club members get 25 bonus trail points with purchase. So blast into Maverick today and enjoy that unmistakable Baja flavor. Maverick. Adventure's first stop.
Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crimelines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. Belinda Temple was murdered on January 11th, 1999 at 8 months pregnant. Her husband, David Temple, said he was out with their son when someone broke in. The police didn't believe him, but building a case would not be easy. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome back to Crimelines. This is a two-parter, and this is part 2 of that two-parter. So if you accidentally clicked on this one without listening to part 1, you're going to want to back up and spend an hour with that episode before coming back to this one. When we left off with the last episode, a grand jury had concluded in April of 1999, 3 months after 30-year-old Belinda Temple had been murdered. No indictment was handed down, though it doesn't seem like they really expected to get one. They were using the process to get witnesses on the record before memories faded and while they still continued to investigate. There was some physical evidence that had been sent out to the FBI lab for testing, but this evidence was not an immediate priority for the overtaxed lab. So the authorities in Texas basically had no choice but to just take a number and wait. They were also hoping they would uncover a key piece of evidence they were missing, and that was the murder weapon. They had not found it, but that was not for lack of trying. The investigators believed that David, if he killed Belinda, would have had time to get rid of the gun while he was driving his son around. They went back to a statement that David's old high school friend Buck had made about seeing him driving out by the rice fields, and also David's insistence that he had not been in that area. So they went out into the area with search parties in the hopes of finding the gun, but they never did. And they also could not definitively prove that David even had access to a 12-gauge shotgun. According to David's family, his father bought all 3 of his sons' shotguns for Christmas back in the early 1980s. David's brothers still had theirs, but according to the Temple family, David's gun was long gone. According to them, it had gotten damaged a few years after he had gotten it, and the barrel had split after it had gotten some mud up in it. David's brother Kevin cut off the barrel at the split and held on to it for a little while, but he eventually threw it away. That gun, even if David still had it, wouldn't have been the murder weapon anyway because the Temple family said that David had a 20-gauge shotgun, not a 12-gauge. And the evidence at the scene indicated that the murder weapon was a 12-gauge. This struck the investigators as odd because the other 2 guns bought at the same time were 12-gauge shotguns. So their dad bought 2 of the kids one type of gun, and then the middle child got a different one. When asked about this, David's father said he got the 20-gauge because it cost less. But I don't think that cleared anything up because it would be unusual that a parent would get all of his kids the same basic gift for Christmas, but then one gets the cheaper version. As for David's brother's 12-gauge shotguns, neither had loaned theirs to David, and they were accounted for. This purchase of these 3 shotguns was from the early 1980s, so nearly 20 years before this, and the family did not have records to prove they bought David a 20-gauge. But on the other hand, it also meant the police didn't have records to prove they didn't. We can't entirely ignore that 12 days before the murder, David loaded up his truck with hunting gear. We don't know what was in there one way or the other because no one saw David hunting because he didn't actually go. So we don't know if he had another 12-gauge shotgun in there that he had borrowed or had owned, or if he had a 20-gauge shotgun in there, or if he had no shotgun at all and just took a rifle. There's just a huge question mark around this gun, and every shotgun the police came across for the next year or so was processed for blood and brain tissue. None of them ever turned out to be the murder weapon. And with this, the first year of the investigation wrapped up without any answers. I think it's clear to anyone who has followed any true crime cases that David would be living under a cloud of suspicion during this time. After Belinda's death, he pretty much right away moved out of the house, which is understandable, and he and his son moved in with his parents. He put the house up for sale and had some friends come by to help him move because while this cloud was following him, he still had a lot of support. His close friend and coworker Quentin stood by him for a while, even though Quentin's wife Tammy was suspicious. Quite a few of Belinda's friends were, and so was her family. The investigators fully suspected David, and that was no secret to anyone, especially not Belinda's family. That said, they were pretty upset at the slow pace of this investigation, or rather, the initial fast pace and seemingly closing in on David early on, only for it to slow to a crawl. This was a case where the investigators believed they knew what happened and who did it, but they didn't have the forensic evidence and/or eyewitnesses to prove it. So let's go ahead and walk through their theory now. The investigators believed that David had decided to kill Belinda. According to those who knew him, he was not someone who acted without a plan, so they did not believe this was spur of the moment. Maybe that day, when he came home early from work, he decided to put his plan into motion, but they do believe that he had premeditated this. So, when Belinda got home from work, David was ready as soon as she walked in the door. He met her near or at the door with the shotgun, which accounted for why she didn't take her shoes off and why her glasses were still on when she went upstairs, and why her keys were discarded on a step. At gunpoint, David forced Belinda up to the closet where he then shot her. Then, in a rush to set up his alibi, David got Evan, who was sick that day, and climbed into his truck. He had forgotten to move Evan's car seat from Belinda's car into his car, and he didn't have time to pause long enough to install a car seat. What if someone had heard the shotgun blast and called the police? He needed to put as much distance between himself and the scene as fast as possible. David drove Evan around, disposing of evidence like the gun, maybe even some bloody clothing, and he made sure that the two of them showed up on security footage. When David returned to the house, he then smashed the glass, pulled down the television, and opened a few drawers on the first floor to make it look like there was a break-in. He then ran back out and brought Evan across the street to the neighbors, and at this point, we have potential witnesses to what was going on, Peggy and Mike, the neighbors. Except, what did they even witness? David shut the gate behind him, and he was alone in the house for about 10 minutes, while Shaka, his dog, wouldn't let anyone get past. So he had even more time at this point to continue to stage the scene. And in this case, they did not believe the motive was money. Other than the life insurance policy that Belinda got through her teaching job, David didn't really gain much financially. What he avoided was the embarrassment and possible shame of getting a divorce. There is no disputing that Belinda was a good and faithful wife to him. She went out of her way to work out when he complained that she had put on a little weight. She worked a full-time job and then after work would take care of Evan, often alone, while David pursued his high school coaching career. And I mean, he also pursued a girlfriend, but she didn't know about that part. But she might find out, and the world might find out, if there was a divorce. Belinda was the long-suffering wife, and David would look like the bad guy if he left Belinda for another woman, particularly while she was pregnant. It seems unbelievable to me at times that anyone could think this way, that someone would think that they're better off killing another person so that they don't look like the bad guy. But it happens over and over again. Sometimes people kill their whole families just to protect their ego. So even though I don't understand it, I can't pretend it isn't reality. We can just add this to the list of things I don't understand, but also accept as fact. What we're talking about in situations like this is the idea of a false self. This is the persona that people use to compensate for their inadequacies. They use it to impress other people and really to deflect from and to protect their true self. The false self would be David Temple being seen as the loving family man with the perfect home, the perfect wife, the perfect relationship, and his inability to deal with the fallout of people seeing through that persona. The only way David could be with Heather Scott without taking the blow to his false self would be if Belinda died. That was how the investigator saw it. David, his family, and his supporters said there was just no way David would have killed his wife and his unborn daughter. He may not have been the perfect husband, but he wasn't some raging narcissist who would rather kill his wife than get a divorce. And according to David, at the time, he wasn't even thinking about getting a divorce. His relationship with Heather wasn't that serious, and the person he truly loved and wanted to be with was Belinda. So this investigation continued on into 2000, a year after Belinda's murder. And then in the spring, according to Catherine Casey's book, Shattered, an article ran in the local paper, the Katy Times, about a search that was executed on a storage unit David had rented. After he moved out of his house and in with his parents, he had a lot of stuff he put into storage. I could not find the article archived in any of the places I have access to, but according to Shattered, the article included information from the search warrant affidavit. It said that someone David worked with had told the police that he had seen shotgun shells in David's home. It went on to say the coworker's wife also spoke with the police to tell them about the problems in David and Belinda's marriage. Though the names of these two witnesses were redacted and not published in the paper, pretty much everyone knew who this would be. What coworker did David have who would have been in his house and whose wife would have any insight into the Temples' marriage? It had to be their friends, Quentin and Tammy. And it turned out that is who it was, but Quentin was not the only one who saw shotgun shells in David's house. This happened when he was moving and all of those friends came to help. Quentin and another friend both saw the box of shells, which seemed off for David to have when he was insisting he didn't even have a shotgun. David would later say that this box of shells was several years old, and it was just one of those things that he hadn't gotten around to getting rid of yet. According to what Quentin and Tammy told Catherine Casey, David was very angry when this article came out because that's when he learned just how much Quentin and Tammy had spoken to the police. And when that article came out, he was allegedly looking for Quentin. This had happened a few weeks before school ended for the year, and Quentin said he was told by the higher-ups in the school district to just take his vacation days for the rest of the year and then look for a new job. He said it was framed to him as being for his own safety and well-being, but he was confused why he was the one being forced out if David and David's reaction was the problem. The police were equally as concerned for the couple's well-being. They showed up at Tammy's school and accompanied her as she picked up her kids from school and daycare, and then they packed some bags and got out of town for a bit. They ended up moving that summer nearly 4 hours away to the Fort Worth area. They were that genuinely afraid for their own safety. Meanwhile, David kept going to work and living in the community. He bought a house in late May 2001, about 2.5 years after Belinda's death, and then 2 weeks later, he and Heather Scott married. David marrying the woman he cheated on Belinda with was hard for Belinda's family, particularly since that meant Heather became Evan's mother figure. It probably would have hurt them no matter who David married, since they believed he had killed Belinda, but marrying Heather, the person they believe he killed Belinda for, was almost too much to bear. At this point, Belinda's case was still open, and it was being investigated as new information came in, but it wasn't being worked on full-time. The detectives had to move on to other cases. But then, in April of 2003, something happened out in California that got the Belinda Temple case reinvigorated. And that was the tragic murder of Laci Peterson. Laci had gone missing in December of 2002 when she was 8 months pregnant. It wasn't until April that the body of her child, Connor, was found, and then Laci's body was found about a mile away. In that case, Laci's husband, Scott Peterson, was arrested very quickly, and as we know, the case blew up in the media. This was a time before social media, before we more regularly saw cases get that type of public awareness, like the murders of Gabby Petito and the murders of Shanann, Cece, and Bella Watts. So in this time period, the Laci Peterson case was about as big as it got. And Belinda's family was thinking, what about Belinda and her baby Aaron? It's the same story in their eyes. A man decides he wants to move on with his new girlfriend, and between him and that plan was a pregnant wife. After seeing this all unfold, Belinda's father emailed the district attorney to essentially demand that something be done, and the DA passed the case on to a star prosecutor in his office, Kelly Siegler. She took a look at the case and felt that there was something here. Some early evidence that had been sent to the FBI lab had only just come back. I mean, various pieces had come back over the years, but in 2001, everything got paused when the FBI turned their focus to the September 11th attacks. Nothing that had come in up to that point, and even a little after, had been the slam dunk evidence they needed, so it would just get filed away in the case file. But then in April of 2003, they got some gunshot residue tests back. These were done on a warm-up suit of David's that was in David and Belinda's bedroom, and also on shoes of David's that were found by the back door. These tests came back positive. The FBI suggested they do additional tests, including metallurgy tests, to see if they can match the composition of the GSR on David's clothing with the GSR found on Belinda's clothing. This was pretty big because David's hands had been swabbed for GSR on the day of the murder, and the test showed that there was a small amount. But it was small enough that it could have just been transfer from him touching the body, but if there was more on his clothing, that could be the forensic tie they needed. It was while waiting on those final tests that Kelly Siegler decided to move forward with the case. The GSR was at least some forensic evidence, and with the movement in the Laci Peterson case, the public at large could now conceive of a scenario where a husband would kill his pregnant wife for a woman he had barely started seeing. The tides had changed on what a jury could understand as possible. So on November 30th, 2004, David Temple was arrested and charged with murder. He was granted bond, which he paid, and he headed home to wait on the trial.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
In February of 2005, Belinda's parents were guests on the, at the time, brand new CNN show, Nancy Grace. Earlier the same day they were set to appear, knowing that that show was coming, David's family held a press conference of their own. And they held it at Belinda's grave. They did it to show their support for David, though he was not there. They said he was at church during their press conference. So we have two sides of a family going to the media, and some felt that the graveside press conference was disrespectful to Belinda and to her family. Not that they spoke out, but the optics of where they chose to do so. And this is one of those areas where cases get a little hard to cover. We're entering a gray zone. I am absolutely 100% uncomfortable thinking about this press conference being held at Belinda's graveside. It feels like her grave was being used as a prop in a media campaign. But on the other hand, like I think I said in the last episode, I have no doubt David's family loved Belinda. I know one of her sisters-in-law specifically was absolutely heartbroken over losing Belinda to the point she had to distance herself from the family for a while. They are also co-victims in this murder, so who am I to sit here and judge what they do when they've gone through the worst-case scenario, the death of someone they loved very much, and the arrest of someone else they loved very much. I guess I fall on the side of disagreeing with the Temple's decision of where to hold the press conference, but also knowing it's not my place to get indignant about it, if that makes sense. These dueling media appearances, both the press conference and the nationally televised Nancy Grace show, gave the impression that this may become a trial by media. But then I learned what attorney David had hired, and it was Dick DeGuerin. Dick DeGuerin had successfully defended Robert Durst against a murder charge related to the death of Morris Black, which is a case I covered in July of 2020. It was a two-parter on the crimes of Robert Durst. The Morris Black episode is labeled with his name, so you can find it if you're interested in learning more about that. Dick DeGuerin's most famous client, I would say, was David Koresh. DeGuerin was the attorney Koresh's mother had hired, and he was the one who tried to work with him for a peaceful surrender during the siege on Waco. So we have Kelly Siegler for the state and Dick DeGuerin for the defense. At that time, even more so now, but even at that time, these were two powerhouses who were well known in the media. They were known for pulling out all the stops at trials, and they are both very persuasive speakers, so they're going to get a lot of media coverage on this case just because of them. I have watched a lot of trials, and I've seen very competent attorneys fumble over their words, but these two are not those types of attorneys. They both speak with confidence and authority, So if there was a trial by media, it was going to pale in comparison to what happened in the actual courtroom. So on the state's side, Siegler planned to bring in the gunshot residue evidence, the changing stories from David about the park he went to or didn't go to, and the witnesses to the Temple marriage. And she also had some other witnesses who would help bring in various pieces of this circumstantial case, but that was only if she could get them to testify. One of these witnesses was a friend of David's brother, Kevin. His name was Clint, and he grew up with the Temple brothers, and he also went hunting with them. He came forward to tell the state that David did, in fact, own a 12-gauge shotgun, or at least he did when they were teenagers. He said that he had not seen David with a 20-gauge shotgun, and he had, in fact, never seen any of the Temples use a 20-gauge. He said that at some point in the 1980s, Kevin showed him a 12-gauge that had a split barrel. Kevin told him the story about getting mud in it, which matched the story of what David said happened to his 20-gauge. And then later, he saw Kevin with a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, which again fit in with the story that Kevin cut the barrel where it had split. Clint was sure that the guns he saw with his own eyes were all 12-gauge shotguns, consistent with the murder weapon. When Clint's name showed up on the witness list, Dick DeGuerin was curious what he was going to testify to, and Kelly Siegler said, according to Catherine Casey's book Shattered, that he needed to ask Kevin about it. That night, Kevin called and left a message on Clint's voicemail insisting that David never had a 12-gauge shotgun. Clint's memory was going back 13 to 15 years. Yes, it's very odd that everything in his story about a 12-gauge lines up with the family story about a 20-gauge. But maybe he was remembering it was a 12-gauge, but it wasn't. And that's the type of thing Dick DeGuerin would bring up on cross-examination. Calling a witness ahead of time to try to clear up their testimony is just not okay. But Clint wasn't the only one to get a phone call. The other was a woman named Cindy who showed up on the witness list. She was a high school girlfriend of David's brother Darren, and she had a story from back when David was a teenager. According to Cindy, Darren came to her very upset one day after David had lost his temper at home. He had been getting into trouble at school, and his mom was trying to talk to him about his behavior. Usual stuff, but then it started escalating into an argument. Darren got between them to defend his mother from David, not physically, but David was being disrespectful to her, so Darren jumped in, and this turned the argument towards Darren. According to what Cindy said, Darren said, David grabbed a shotgun and pointed it in his face. Darren and their mother managed to get David to put the gun down and walk away, but Darren was, as you can imagine, very shaken up. So this story may not have gotten past the judge. It's hearsay. It's prejudicial. It's all the things someone like Dick DeGuerin could easily make a case to a judge to exclude at trial. And it should have been, like Clint's testimony, left to DeGuerin. But Cindy ended up getting a phone call from Darren. He asked her why she was on the list to testify, and she told him. He told her that what she said happened never happened. Not that he never told her it happened, but that it just hadn't happened. Cindy felt like Darren was trying to tell her not to testify. Cindy still lived in the area, so after this tense phone call ended, she called Kelly Siegler and said she was nervous about testifying. She didn't want anything to come back on her or her family. Siegler said she told Cindy she didn't have to testify if it really would have that type of impact on her life, but Cindy, in the end, said she would testify if she was called to. As expected, Dick DeGuerin argued to exclude Cindy's testimony, and it looks to me like she was not called to the stand. I mean, I couldn't find any reference to her testimony in any of the reporting, so I have to assume she didn't testify. But there were lots of other people who did testify when this case went to trial in the fall of 2007. By that point, everyone was relying on their memory of something that happened 8 years before. The only evidence that was not relying on memory was the CCTV footage. The state turned it against David, showing that there were gaps in his timeline from when he left his home until he showed up at the grocery store, and then when he went from the grocery store and ended up at the Home Depot. Those pockets of time were sufficient to commit the crime and get rid of the evidence. The defense, however, leaned into a different timeline, the one of when David was at home. They argued that David did not have enough time to get Belinda upstairs, to kill her, to clean up whatever he needed to stage the scene, to get Evan and the shotgun into his truck and drive away. No matter how long it took him to get to the grocery store, there just was not enough time. To contradict this, Kelly Siegler demonstrated in the courtroom the process of opening drawers and pulling down a TV, which was all done to stage the scene, and it took her about 30 seconds to do it all. So clearly, the state was saying through this demonstration, there was time, not a lot of time, which is why the staging was so superficial according to the state, but it was there. To back up the timeline showing that David did have time to get rid of the evidence after he left the house, they had Buck testify. If you remember, he was the high school friend who saw David in the area that he said he wasn't in on that day. And then the state had a parade of witnesses to testify about the Temple marriage and David's demeanor after Belinda's death and about his affair. And this includes his friend Quentin, who testified both about the affair and about David asking about Heather very soon after Belinda's murder. Of course, Heather Scott Temple testified. Texas does have spousal privilege, which meant she could not be compelled to testify to anything that was said during the course of the marriage. So if David told her 3 years into their marriage that he killed Belinda, she could not be compelled to testify to that. But it does not apply to anything prior to the marriage, so she could testify to what David did or did not say leading up to Belinda's murder and then for 2.5 years after. Though Heather was called by the state, she certainly was not an enthusiastic prosecution witness. She was standing by David, who was her husband, and she believed in his innocence, so this made her a little bit argumentative while being questioned. This rarely goes well for a witness, and it does not reflect well on them or their quote-unquote side. So I really wish Heather could have been able to push this down a little bit more, because as an observer, it's not going to fall back on the prosecution that she was hostile towards them. It's really going to fall back on David. It got so bad at one point that the judge excused the jury and told Heather to stop arguing with the attorneys because she just wasn't going to win. Just listen to the questions and then answer them. Through her testimony, Heather took a couple steps back from her early statements to the police, like when she said that David said he was falling in love with her just days before Belinda was killed. She said that the wording was being forced on her, even though every page of her written statement was initialed by her, and she didn't exactly clear up what she had meant to say. So I think it left the impression that he said something along those lines. Heather was also asked why she left out of her statement that she and David had been physically intimate. Heather said she didn't purposely leave it out, which of course sounded like a lie. Just be honest and say, yes, I did because I was stressed, or I was confused, or I was worried I was going to lose my job, or whatever. No one is going to believe that you accidentally left out that very relevant detail when the police were specifically questioning you about the nature of your relationship to someone. It takes chunks out of your credibility, whereas admitting to it and saying, yes, but, mitigates it. It's hard when someone says things that bring into question their credibility, because when they do say things that they really want the jury to understand and believe, it's not going to land as well. Like when Heather stuck to her story that her relationship with David just wasn't that serious. And there is some evidence of this because she had her ongoing flirtatious relationship with the other teacher, Quentin, as evidence of that. I just don't know how much the jury believed her. Heather's roommate, Tara, was also called to testify to what she observed, and that included David sending flowers to Heather a month after his wife was murdered, and then helping out with the yard work that spring. The defense tried to get her to concede that everything she said happened actually happened the following year. But Tara insisted she knew when it happened. It was notable to her because it was right after Belinda's death. Witness-wise, to build this circumstantial case, the state came out pretty strong, poking holes in David's story that he was in love with his wife, that his relationship with Heather was just casual and not serious, and then they turned his alibi, which proved innocence, into alibi building, which proved guilt. But what the prosecution ended up having none of was forensic evidence, and that included the gunshot residue evidence. The judge had not ruled on this pre-trial, but there was a hearing during the trial where all of it was kicked out. What happened was that while the FBI was still planning to do the metallurgy test, they abandoned that type of testing entirely when the National Academy of Sciences did an independent review of the method. The evidence gained from it was too inexact and too misleading to be considered useful. It was, as we talk about from time to time, junk science. And the state ended up not even getting the GSR positive tests in. At first, it looked like it was just going to be a hiccup. The FBI employee who initially ran the test and found the GSR on both the clothing and the shoes ended up being decertified, so they had to bring in someone else. Like most scientists, she decided to run her own tests rather than relying on someone else's conclusions, and she did not get the same results. She only detected trace GSR on the jacket that had been on the bed. She did not find it on the shoes that were not in the room and were therefore even more valuable evidence. The defense argued then to the judge that the results were just unreliable. They questioned the FBI's protections against cross-contamination, given that the lab where they were testing this evidence shared a ventilation system with the shooting range. And the defense won this battle, rightly so. The GSR was out. I think cross-contamination was a distinct possibility here, because if that jacket had GSR on it from the shooting, why didn't it have any blood? This was a close-range shooting with a 12-gauge shotgun. The expert testimony in this case left me with the impression that there was no way the jacket could have gotten GSR on it, but not blood. According to the book Shattered, there was some speculation at this point that the defense would not put on a case at all, given that the state's case had no eyewitnesses or forensics. They'd basically just argue there was nothing more for them to do since the state failed to meet their burden. But DeGuerin had promised the jury during his opening statement that they would hear from key witnesses, including that they would hear from David Temple himself. So I think it would have been surprising for him to not at least put David on the stand, since the jury was expecting him to testify. You don't promise the jury something you don't deliver. So the defense put on their case, which included an expert who had an alternative theory as to how the window glass shattered. So remember, the glass distribution in the room made it pretty clear that the glass shards from the window went flying while the door was open. Well, right next to this door, in the direction it swung open, was a hutch. The expert's theory was that the glass was broken, but then the door hit the hutch as it swung open, and that is what scattered the remaining pieces of smashed glass in that direction. There was a dent in the door that they said could have come from the hutch. There were some issues with this, like the hutch had no glass on it. It didn't seem likely it would have hit the hutch with no glass actually falling on it. And the knickknacks that were on the hutch had not been knocked over. So if this door swung open hard enough to dent the door and send glass 13 feet, how had nothing fallen over? Belinda's parents actually had that hutch, so the investigators went out to their house to get it, to see where the door would have hit if it opened into it. And the dent did not match anything on the hutch, which proved that the door wasn't dented by the hutch, and so it didn't entirely disprove this theory. This was an alternative theory, but it did take away any evidence that this was what happened. Another key defense witness, well, it was really 3 witnesses. These are the boys that heard a bang while they were watching a movie after school. They all testified to what they told the police 8+ years before, and the timing of the bang they heard would have been around 4:30, which is when David had an airtight alibi. If the sound they heard was a shotgun, David absolutely did not kill Belinda. The state did have a rebuttal witness waiting in the wings. This was a man in the neighborhood who said he saw a truck backfire at the same time the boys heard a bang, and he was ready to testify. But they ended up not presenting his evidence at all. The fuzzy memories of 3 boys disputed by the fuzzy memory of another witness seemed like a bit of a wash.
Macy's has all of your Grill Master essentials for Father's Day. Stop by to get our hand-trimmed chicken breast and certified Angus beef patties that are ready to grill, so Dad can have his favorite dinner. Make sure to browse our bakery to find the perfect no-work Father's Day treat with our decadent peanut butter bars or famous donuts. Right now, you can get boneless beef ribeye steaks for $12.99 per pound at Macy's. Shop these Father's Day essentials in-store or online at Macys.com through June 18th. Macy's, happy shopping!
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
The defense also called the neighbor Peggy, who had watched Evan on the evening of the murder until family could come and get him, and she testified that Evan was feeling better, which would explain why David took him out to the park, even though he had been sick earlier in the day. That was a big hang-up for people. Why would he take a sick kid to the park? Well, Peggy said he wasn't that sick. But then on cross-examination, the state asked about something Peggy had said in her grand jury testimony. She testified that Evan was normally a big eater, but he didn't eat much of his dinner that night. So they were asking, doesn't that indicate that he actually wasn't feeling that well? The defense then called various members of David's family to the stand. His father and his brothers testified about how David was given a 20-gauge shotgun and not a 12-gauge, even though the other 2 were given 12-gauge shotguns. I don't know that there was much they could do to make the story sound less suspicious, because it is suspicious. It very well could have been what happened, but it also sounds like the type of story you make up later. The family also faltered on testimony about the nature of David and Heather's relationship because they were hesitating to call it an affair. In their grand jury testimony, some of them even denied that they had knowledge that David had had an affair, even though he had admitted it to them by that point. And of course, the state used that to call into question their credibility. And then we get into some testimony splitting hairs over what an affair means versus just being unfaithful. But to the average jury member, it all meant the same and it didn't really move anything along. I just want to point out one bit of specific cross-examination because Kelly Siegler is known for her courtroom displays. We already saw one in this trial where she, quote-unquote, staged a scene to show how fast it goes. I actually used a picture of a different courtroom demonstration she did when I did a presentation at the True Crime Podcast Festival. The case involved a courtroom reenactment, so I put up a picture of Kelly Siegler with the Susan Wright trial alongside the O.J. Simpson famous picture of him sticking his arthritic hand into a glove. Now, the display that I used from the Susan Wright trial is probably the one Siegler is most known for. I covered the case when I was doing live streaming a few years ago, and I probably should do a more in-depth episode on it for the podcast because it does have some elements I think are always interesting to discuss more in depth, particularly because that case does involve what was at the time called battered woman syndrome. Anyway, in that case, Kelly Siegler had a bed rolled into court, and she straddled her co-counsel on the bed as she acted out the murder. It was intense. Now, this demonstration wasn't nearly that over the top, but it did what she wanted it to do. It made a point. She asked David's brother Kevin to step off the stand and hold a shotgun they had in court as an example of their murder weapon. So he took the gun, and then she asked him to demonstrate how he would then pick up a 50-pound television. If you remember from part 1, the Temple's television was found on the floor as though someone had thought about stealing it but then abandoned it, still plugged in. Kevin couldn't demonstrate picking up the TV while holding the shotgun because, as he conceded, he couldn't have done it. This brought up a point. If someone with a shotgun had killed Belinda, how did they expect to get out of there with a heavy TV and the gun? Now, there was a lot more testimony that, for the sake of time, I can't get into detail on, but I do recommend Catherine Casey's book Shattered if you do want all those details. I want to instead skip ahead to the testimony of the defendant, David Temple. As the jury was promised, he took the stand. Dick DeGuerin started as client with the obvious. He loved Belinda, he loved Erin, the daughter she was carrying, he loved his son, and he never would have done anything to hurt any of them. He called his relationship with Heather Scott a mistake, and he said that he wasn't in love with her at the time. The jury at this point did know that they were married, so this may have been a little bit of a hard sell, and they also heard the testimony from Heather's roommate Tara, who insisted the relationship started back up about a month after the murder with that delivery of roses. But David insisted that was not true. This affair was just emails and a casual romantic relationship that had only been intimate 2 or 3 times. As for what David testified to on the day of the murder, we are going to see a change in his story. I mentioned it in the last episode. He had told the police that Belinda got home at 3:45. On the stand, he pushed it out closer to 4 p.m., maybe even later, which then took at least 15 minutes out of the state's timeline for this crime to have occurred. He said Evan woke up feeling better, so he told her to rest before he said he was going to take Evan to the park. In addition to inconsistencies with his earlier statements, we also have some inconsistencies with what other people testified to. David said Belinda took a magazine up with her to read in bed, which was his reasoning for her having her glasses on. But the jury had already heard that Belinda wore glasses for driving, not for reading. David said he put Evan in the car seat, even though witnesses and the crime scene photos showed that there was no car seat in his truck. And David stuck to the story that he came home when he did so that they could have dinner together as a family before Belinda went out for that night. But the jury had already heard from someone in the bunco group that she always ate with them. And these issues in his testimony came up on direct examination. That's not even cross-examination. If the jury had been paying attention to all of the witnesses, they probably picked up on these things just through his direct testimony. Now on cross, it got even worse for David. I will say that the reports of his demeanor on the stand were great. He was polite, he was calm, he was not argumentative. But the state had some other evidence that they confronted David with. After Belinda's death, for a little while, David was still in touch with her twin sister, Brenda. Brenda would call mostly to ask about Evan, to see what's going on with the investigation, and just find out what was going on. It's no secret now that she suspected David, so she had started recording those phone calls. And David lied to her in those, so the prosecution had even more to use against David. One thing on the recording was that he told Brenda that he was wearing his ring and his watch when he was out on the day of the murder, and that explained why the robber hadn't taken any of his things. Except, in the crime scene photos, his watch and his ring were clearly on the tray on the dresser. So he had to admit that he lied to Brenda. And that was not the only thing he lied about. He had also said he was with another woman over New Year's Eve, but that he did not have sex with her, which we know was a lie. And he had to admit that on the stand. Obviously, we can understand why he wouldn't want to readily admit to an affair to his sister-in-law, but again, we're chipping away at credibility, and Kelly Siegler and the prosecution team here was very good at that. While David was testifying on direct examination, he did bring up the teenage neighbor Joe. We haven't heard his name in a while, but as you remember from last episode, he had some issues with Belinda because Belinda was both his teacher and his neighbor, and she had, quote-unquote, told on him to his parents about his truancy issues. David testified that they had issues with Joe. On cross-examination, David said he didn't know if Joe did it, but he wouldn't doubt it. And then on redirect, David said he knew Joe's family had shotguns, and when DeGuerin asked him what he thought about that, David said he didn't want to falsely accuse anyone because he knew what it felt like, but he thought Joe needed to be investigated more. The defense got Joe's name out there in front of the jury mostly through David and a bit through the investigating officers. But they were not allowed to use what is probably the most evidence anyone has dug up on Joe, and that was his failed polygraph, or I should say failed polygraph times 3. These tests are just not admissible in court, and I mentioned the issues with Joe's polygraph specifically in the last episode. 1, he was a known drug user, and 2, he was a 16-year-old in special education classes. The defense did not put Joe on the stand, but the state did when they called him as a rebuttal witness. They had Joe's school records entered into evidence that showed nothing about him being aggressive or fighting in school. All of his behavioral issues were things like skipping class, falling asleep in class, and not bothering to do schoolwork. And I think the jury could see this with Joe on the stand. He was less combative with the attorneys questioning him than most of the witnesses on both sides of this case. Joe admitted that Belinda told his parents about him skipping class, and he wasn't happy when his parents grounded him because they took his truck away. But then he just snuck out while his parents were at work, including taking his truck, so it didn't really impact him that much. He denied hurting Belinda or even wanting to. On cross-examination, a bit of a stir was created when the defense asked Joe about being given immunity before he testified in front of the grand jury, which was true, but it was also slightly misleading. Joe was given immunity in regards to his drug use and purchase attempts from the day of the murder. He was not given total and blanket immunity for everything. If he got up there and he implicated himself in drug-related offenses, he was fine. But if he implicated himself in Belinda's murder, he would still be charged. But by even asking about immunity in front of the jury, it gave them the impression that Joe wasn't going to be charged with anything, no matter what. Once that issue was cleared up, Joe's behavioral issues from his teen years were addressed. The fact that he was skipping school and smoking pot, and Belinda had told his parents about it. But Joe did what I had already suggested Heather do. He answered yes, but. Yes, he was angry, but it wasn't really that big of a deal. Yes, his group of friends knocked over the temple's Christmas decor, but he told them to make it right. Yes, he did this bad thing, but here is the mitigating factor. And it certainly didn't hurt that, based on the reports I've seen, Joe came across as sincere. Dick DeGuerin went for him on cross, trying to rile him up to show his aggressive side, and it just never appeared. But the defense still pointed towards Joe during their closing argument, saying that there was more evidence here against Joe. Was there enough to convict him? No, there wasn't. So that meant there couldn't nearly be enough to convict David, since they had even less. The jury deliberated for a couple of hours that day, and then they started up the next morning before coming back with their verdict on the afternoon of November 15th, 2007. They found David Temple guilty of the murder of Belinda Temple. He was then sentenced to life in prison. Heather stayed married to him throughout his incarceration, and she retained custody of Evan, raising him as her own. Catherine Casey's book, Shattered, came out in 2010. I think this one and Die My Love are her two best books. If you're looking for some true crime reads, I recommend both of them. But when Shattered came out, the public learned for what I think is the first time that there were witnesses who felt they had been threatened by David, meaning Tammy and Quentin, and those who felt the family had tried to influence their testimony, like Clint and Cindy. I mentioned in the last episode that I didn't know if the listener who recommended this case, Barbara, was still listening, and I found out she is. She let me know that Catherine Casey's book and the details in it helped her form her own opinion on David Temple's guilt. David's family, however, stood by him and supported him through his appeals process in the hopes they could prove his innocence. And while working on the appeal, Dick DeGuerin got a phone call. The call came from a man named Daniel, who claimed that he had overheard a conversation where Joe confessed to having killed Belinda. Sort of confessed. He said it was a few days after the murder when he was out on the patio with Joe and some other friends. He went inside to use the bathroom, and when he came back out, the guys were talking about a burglary gone wrong. They said that they had shot a dog in the process, and they put the dog's body in a closet. Daniel, after learning about Belinda's murder, thought the dog was code, meaning Belinda. This story came about 5 years after David's conviction, so he was already in the appeals process. So the defense had Daniel deposed and turned the information over to the state. And it was while the new prosecutor was looking into this lead that they realized there were documents and reports that had not been turned over to the defense that probably should have been. And it seems the majority of them had to do with the investigation into Joe and his friends. It would end up being 1,300 pages that hadn't been turned over. Kelly Siegler would say she turned over everything she was required to by law, but the appellate court disagreed. These were documents about the very person the defense was presenting as their reasonable alternative suspect in court. If this was not exculpatory, what was? Some of the bigger things withheld was that Joe had previously taken one of his father's shotguns without permission and had his friend Cody hide it under the bed. The gun was one that the state had gotten in their possession and tested it for blood, but the deputy who took it into evidence had never documented how he got it. This shotgun was similar to the one that would have been used to kill Belinda. It was a 12 gauge with a reloaded double-aught buckshot in it, which is just like what they found at the scene. Shotguns do not have rifling like other guns, so there is really no way to match striations. But this gun was the closest shotgun to the murder weapon they had. Maybe the state should have pursued that more rather than all the time they spent on a shotgun that David may or may not have been given for Christmas 20 years before. The other glaring thing in these reports was about a break-in from a week before Belinda's murder. It is not clear if Joe was involved, and there is some indication that he was not involved. However, his friends were. They smashed glass to gain entry, they rifled through some things, and they took a CD player off the stand and put it on the floor on its side, not unlike the TV that was in the Temple's home. The motive of this break-in wasn't just to steal things, it was more to get back at the person who lived there because one of the teens had an issue with them. David's attorneys argued that these documents showed that the police had never cleared Joe and his friends. They simply stopped investigating them when they decided to focus on David. These discovery issues turned out to be the problem for the appellate court. The new witness, Daniel, ended up being basically worthless as far as a witness went by the time this got to the hearing for a new trial. He had already been deposed by the defense, he was grilled by investigators, and so when he was put on the stand for the hearing, he was just a jumble of what he remembered, what the defense may have told him, what the investigators may have told him, and he just contradicted himself too much. But it was because he came forward that someone took a look at the case and discovered the pages and pages of documentation that the defense should have been given. So while his testimony wasn't very helpful, the fact that he came forward was extremely helpful. In July of 2015, the judge ruled that David deserved a new trial due to these Brady violations. The state, of course, appealed, but the Texas Court of Appeals sided with the trial judge. In November of 2016, it was clear David was getting a new trial, and in December, he was released on bond, 9 years after his initial conviction. The question was, would the state put him back on trial? They didn't have more evidence, but they also didn't have less evidence. They didn't get anything kicked out. The only thing that would really change in a new trial was that the defense would have more evidence to shore up their theory of Joe as a reasonable alternative suspect. The state didn't really debate it for long before indicating they were going to retry David, and the new trial started on July 8th, 2019, 2.5 years after David was released from prison, and 20 years after Belinda's murder. The prosecution case was largely the same, and the defense case was as well, with the exception of pushing even harder on Joe being the alternative suspect. And as such, the state decided they had to defend Joe even more this time around. They had his girlfriend from the time testify about how upset he was that Belinda was killed. His friend Cody testified that the shotgun Joe snuck out of his house was with him on the day of the murder, and he turned it over to the police as soon as he was asked about it. And that's the gun that tested negative for blood. A forensic examiner testified that everything else they took from Joe's house also tested negative, and there was just no evidence that pointed to him. While most of the media coverage at this time was about the testimony happening in the courtroom, there was one odd thing that happened outside of the court that took people by surprise. 3 days after the trial started, Heather Scott Temple filed for divorce. She had stood by David after Belinda's death, even marrying him. She didn't divorce him in the 9 years he was incarcerated, and she dedicated herself to raising his son essentially as a single mother during this period. And then she stayed married to him for 2.5 years while he was waiting on retrial. And then when he went to trial, that was the time she decided she needed to file for divorce. This wasn't a financial fraud case where Heather needed to divorce him to protect assets. She still had to testify in the trial, so it's not like it got her out of that. We don't know why she filed. It could be something as basic as the fact that when someone has been incarcerated and institutionalized for 9 years, they've changed as a person, and when they come out, they're not the same person. And maybe she just didn't want to be married to him any longer. It's really just the timing here that's odd. The hope for Belinda's family was that this indicated that Heather would be more forthcoming in her testimony, because while spousal privilege does extend after separation and divorce, in Texas it is the spouse's choice whether to waive it or not. So Heather and Heather alone decided whether or not she broke spousal privilege. David could not stop her from doing so. But when Heather testified, it was the same as her testimony from the first trial. She and David had an affair, it wasn't that serious as evidenced by her flirting with Quentin, and David never made any admissions to her that he was ever involved in Belinda's death. There really isn't a lot to say about the second trial because much of the main core information at the second trial was very similar to the first. So the jury took the case and they deliberated for 8 hours. They came back on August 6th, 2019 with another guilty verdict. The same jury then sat for the sentencing phase, at which time Belinda and David's son Evan, now an adult, testified. He was asked in this testimony who his mother was, and he identified his real mother as Belinda Temple, but the mother who raised him was Heather. If I was Belinda's family, I would have felt like throwing up after hearing that. That's not to say Evan was wrong. He was a little boy when all of this happened. When his father went to prison, it was Heather who took care of him. Heather got him to school. She did the parent-teacher conferences. She cheered him on. She was playing Santa. She did all of it. His lived experience was that Heather was his mother. That is a fact. But the impact of that on Belinda's family should also be recognized. The reason Heather had the privilege to step into that role for Evan was because their daughter had been murdered. It's just one of those things. People can be on seemingly opposite sides of a topic or an issue, and both still be right. Evan told the jury he believed his father was innocent, and I'm sure that testimony impacted them. He's someone who lost a lot through this entire process, and he was standing by David. The defense also stood by David's innocence during this hearing, and they argued that he had already spent nearly 10 years behind bars, time away from his son, and that should be taken into consideration when resentencing. He had been out of prison for 2.5 years pending the retrial and didn't have any issues re-entering society. The jury then went to deliberate over the sentence. Based on the sentencing laws at the time the murder occurred, plus the time David had already spent in prison, they could have given him anything from probation to life in prison. Pretty much everything but the death penalty was on the table. And this seems to have been too broad of a window for this jury. They sent a note to the judge that 2 of the jurors would not cooperate and they needed to know what to do. So the judge pulled the jury into the courtroom and read them an Allen charge. An Allen charge is a bit controversial, to say the least, but it has been established law in the federal courts since 1896. This episode is already too long to get into the details of that case, but the basic gist of it is that it was a murder trial where the defendant was claiming self-defense. The jury deadlocked, and the judge gave them some guidance that was essentially telling them to listen to each other, and if you found yourself on the opposite side of the majority, maybe consider that you were the one being unreasonable. Being the minority opinion in the jury room was enough cause to reevaluate your vote. That was a federal case, and the Supreme Court said there's nothing wrong with this instruction, so it is allowed in federal courts. And it's up to state courts whether or not they allow an Allen charge within their court system. Nearly half of the states do not allow it. Texas, however, does, so the judge gave an Allen charge and sent the jury back to deliberate. Unanimous decision, however, did not come, and a mistrial was declared. This only applied to sentencing, not guilt or innocence, and we have seen this happen before in places where the jury chooses the sentence. One of the most famous examples is Jodi Arias. The reports in this case on the split between the jurors vary, but I'll say what the jury said happened. In their final note to the judge before suspending deliberations, they said that severe violence had been done to most of their consciences to get as far as they did in the deliberations. They believed that any other jury could have come to a unanimous decision, and the chance of those 12 jurors being assembled together was a fluke. They wrote that 2 of the jurors were unwilling to budge at all, and they recognized the price of a mistrial, but it was best for the families involved that another jury come in. That's what they told the judge. With people speaking to the jury afterwards, it seems that the 2 holdouts wanted a very light sentence, with at least one being committed to giving David time served. The rest wanted a life sentence and had tried to compromise down to a 30 or 40-year sentence. which would mean parole eligibility after 15 or 20 years. Now, given the time David had already served, this was a pretty fair compromise when you have others wanting to give him just time served. But those 2 jurors would not move, and the other 10 were not willing to go that low in sentencing. And that is why the judge had to declare a mistrial. David would not remain free pending a new sentencing hearing. Because he was convicted, the judge raised his bond to $1 million, and he was taken into custody. Had David made bond, he would have been out for quite some time. There were a lot of issues with just holding another sentencing hearing. This jury, the one who had heard all of the evidence over 5 or 6 weeks, had been dismissed. So how would they get a second jury up to speed with all of the evidence in a way that would make sentencing fair? Because of that issue, David appealed, which then delayed sentencing from going forward, and then we have COVID shutdowns in the spring of 2020, and it seemed like sentencing was going to be delayed forever. David's attorneys argued in the appeal that the state law from when Belinda was killed said that the same jury had to determine both guilt and punishment. This would mean that a mistrial for sentencing meant they had to start all the way at the beginning with a new trial. It wasn't until 2005 that the law was changed to say that if a mistrial was declared in just the punishment phase, the new jury only had to decide on punishment. So the defense wanted David to be covered by the law at the time of the murder, which would give him an entirely new trial. The defense worried that by having a sentencing-only jury, they wouldn't have heard the evidence at trial that pointed towards David's innocence, and that evidence may influence their decision in how long he had to stay in prison. David lost this appeal, and sentencing went ahead finally in April of 2023 after an almost 4-year delay. Evan testified again for his father, and so did Heather. She reiterated that in the 18 years she was married to David, they never discussed Belinda or her murder, and she had nothing to offer. David's attorney argued that David should be given a chance at life outside of prison, if only for his son's sake. The jury then deliberated, and this time they managed to come back with a unanimous decision. They gave David a life sentence with parole eligibility after 30 years. David was given credit, of course, for the time he already served, and so he would only have to serve another 17 years before he could apply for parole, and his first parole eligibility date is June of 2040 when he will be 72 years old. This case is not a perfect case. There is a lot of evidence against David Temple, but there are still things that people get hung up on, like the boys hearing a loud bang at no earlier than 4:30, which is when David had an airtight alibi. There was Joe failing the polygraph test repeatedly. There was the fact that his friends had robbed another house to get back at someone, leaving a large item on the ground. There was also a lack of physical and forensic evidence pointing in any direction, so I definitely see why this case is compared to the Scott Peterson case, beyond the victims being both pregnant women whose husbands had affairs. There is evidence of guilt, but there are parts that don't fit, and those parts that don't fit seem to really not fit. I have to say, I do lean towards thinking the jury got it right on this one, but I would never go toe-to-toe with someone who disagreed with me, because I see that side as well. Regardless of what internet debates tell you, it's okay to hold an opinion, but just lightly. David Temple's incarceration hangs 0.000% on my opinion of his guilt, and when I have no stake in something, while other people have very high stakes in it, I know my opinion weighs nothing, and I'm okay with that. With a new conviction and a new sentence, David Temple will, I'm sure, begin appealing, and if we see this going to yet another jury, I'll be sure to keep you updated. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.